It's quite easy to say, well, this is who I am. I come from a Deshastha Brahmin family. I grew up in Bangalore for the first 10 years of my life. I was introduced to African American political thought, which formed a very important aspect of the ways in which I began to think about questions of racialization, and that it is through this that one comes to caste. I mean, that kind of intellectual biography is an easy thing to do. But I think the more difficult question to ask is, what really does that kind of social and intellectual formation do? Because identity, of course, is not destiny. And identitarianism can also shut down conversations. But it does seem to me that there is something very important in asking this question as well. Because when we talk about caste, can there be a more subtle and pernicious divide than caste's fundamental division between thinking and doing? The entire caste order is predicated on the divide between intellectual and manual labor.
In this episode, Anupama Rao reflects on broad trends in the study of caste, including debates and discussions drawing on post-structuralist, Marxist, and anthropological approaches, which have tended to approach caste as a distinctive form of hierarchy and social distinction. This framing helps illuminate the challenges of new approaches and intellectual formations which center critical caste and Dalit studies, scholarship on anti-caste thought, and studies of global caste. This episode was adapted from an event that took place at the Bangalore International Center in December of 2024.
So what I want to start by discussing how caste, as system and structure, has been approached before I briefly address the changing scholarship on caste, which responds both to a set of intellectual shifts in the ways we approach caste as an analytic and our location in the political present. In the second part of this presentation, I want to think about caste in the classroom, both here in India and in the United States, where I teach, as a way to enter a conversation about current discussions about global caste. And then I'll present a short bit from the book I'm currently working on, Ambedkar in America, and use that as a way to reflect on a remarkable, if under-acknowledged, challenge to standard positions on caste before its time, so to speak. I'll be discussing Ambedkar's essay, Castes in India. And broadly speaking, really the idea and the effort is to present discussions about caste as a vibrant field of discussion and debate, centering a set of conversations about self and other, the questions of democracy in the South that caste poses for us, and indeed the broader question of political ethics. So here's the first part, which is a kind of ground clearing in terms of the study of caste. The caste operates, I suggest, as affect, as identity. It structures social experience, and it is an analytic. Like religion and gender, it functions as a practice of social cleavage and a form of collectivity both. That is, it both differentiates and it creates new social groupings. So caste structures fields of power. It functions as a form of social capital in the present and of inherited privilege from the past. The one element of caste that everyone recognizes because it is so pervasive is caste's role in regulating marriage, sexuality, and reproduction. And this is perhaps its most significant aspect. So caste's role in regulating the social reproduction of caste and the relationship between sex and the social. The other aspect of caste that I just wanted to put forward is the argument that I've made that caste functions as something like a political unconscious of the Indian social, and the arguments that many political scientists and theorists in particular, that we see here in India a rather distinctive process of democratization through caste and through what I would call a politics of minority, which transforms the ways in which we might understand democracy itself as both an idea and its many histories. So caste in that sense is relational. It's always been equated with the Indian social, and it's been attributed, as you all know, to deep-rooted religious concepts and conceptions and shared beliefs such as of purity and pollution, occupational hierarchy, and so forth, all of which characterize the interaction between different castes. And so I would say, as a historical anthropologist, the anthropologist or the sociological side of me would say that the caste question then is an inquiry into the logic of group formation, the sociological puzzle of group coherence and social organization, whether it's questions of kinship, tribe, lineage, and state, and so forth, but how we really move towards complex social formations. And it's worth noting two things here. One that sociology itself, the discipline, has always had a tense relationship with ideas of liberal individualism, or at least sociology has made its adjustments with dominant strains of Western political thought, predicated on the social contract, the liberal individual, the acquisitive individual, and so on. So the idea here of, what makes groups, what creates groups, and how do groups operate is in a fundamental tension actually within the traditions of both sociology and political thought, or politics, political science in the more heterodox world, as it were. The second is that sociology and the question, as I've said, of group formation itself contains within it a kind of historicism that is kind of baked in, if I can put it that way. And this really happens through the idea that there are stages through which societies move, that there is kinship, there is clan, there is state formation, but that there is a kind of developmentalism that's built into the ways that societies cohere, operate, and then develop and mature in some sense. And so this also means that comparison, the idea of historical comparison, is built or baked into sociological categories themselves. That kinship is prior and perhaps pre-political in relationship to the ways that we think about the state, and so on and so forth. So the question of kind of sociology thinking about society synchronically, as we suggest, right? So society is something that's kind of opened out and available to us to both experience and analyze, also has or contains within it a kind of historicism. And I think this is quite important. This is, as I said, the anthropological or the sociological part of me. But there's also a kind of conversation here about caste's own history and the many histories of caste, the kind of inbuilt historicity of caste as a concept, which is to say that caste is neither singular nor unchanging. And so to the sociologist's interest in thinking about the group, how it coheres, how it reproduces itself, how it organizes itself, you've got a set of historical questions about caste itself and the ways in which the category of caste has changed and could be historicized. And here you could say that historians, ancient, medieval, early modern, have focused on a number of issues. One, the emergence of things like regionally distinct castes who are associated with militarized pre-colonial regimes. So the emergence of what we today think of as dominant castes, right? Marathas, Rajputs, Gaudas, etc., that these are actually castes that come into historical emergence in the context of their relationship, for instance, with the Mughal Empire, with various notions of the ways in which a militarized society operates, and broadly speaking, kind of pre-colonial formations. There's also a kind of history, or historians have looked at caste's analytic utility for colonial governance and for strategies of so-called indirect rule. That is, that caste becomes, in the colonial period, a bureaucratic identity, right? It's used to kind of name, describe, identify, categorize different caste communities, but to also begin to think about them proportionally, sort of what is the relationship of caste A to caste B in numerical terms, and so on and so forth. And so a kind of historical process to thinking about caste itself as morphing, transforming what we understand the category of caste to be, and the role of caste in structuring relationships of labor and the appropriation of surplus, the access to capital itself, but really that the history of caste, I think, must be seen in conversation with the history of territory and the control over land. So all of this to suggest, in a sense, that there is a kind of complex field of play, right? This is the broader set of studies around caste, both historically and sociologically, that one comes into. So in that sense, anthropologists in particular focused on hierarchy, on caste as what was called a manifestation of cosmological holism, that caste was a structure that encompassed the different castes into a kind of hierarchical formation. This is an argument that is made most importantly by Louis Dumont, who many of you might have heard of, an important sociologist, anthropologist, who writes a text called Homo Hierarchicus, and alongside that also writes a text called From Mandeville to Marx. And Dumont's argument really is to think about caste hierarchy and the hierarchies of caste as being, he does many things, but one of the important things that he does there is to think about the hierarchies of caste as being in absolute opposition to the idea of equality. Or we may think of the model of Sanskritization and Westernization, or the two together, as a way to think about historical transformation from within the caste system itself by Bangalore's own M.N. Srinivas. You have scholars of a Marxist persuasion, historians, anthropologists, political theorists, and scientists, and so on, who think about caste as something like a historic remnant, something that's backward, and might transform into class. And again, as I've said, you've got a number of historians who are thinking in quite complicated ways about how caste operates across society and who begin to think in many ways about caste, I would suggest, on its own terms and the internal logic of caste, its relationship to capital, to society, to politics, and so on. I might think about historians like D.D. Kosambi, for instance, B.D. Chattopadhyay, and more recently, Manu Devadevan, who won the Infosys Prize some years ago for this fantastic, magnificent book called The Prehistory of Hinduism, all of whom begin to really think about the ways in which caste operates as a kind of complex social whole and working in a cross-disciplinary manner really to do that work, everything from archaeology and geology to thinking about literature, I suppose. However, there is a sort of major fault line, it seems to me, in the way that we continue to think about caste and societies of caste. And that has, despite all of these shifts, despite the complex ways in which people have tried to think about caste as a complicated form of inequality, of hierarchy, of stigma, and so on, there tends to be a broad divide or a division, a major fault line, you might say, which really hews along the lines of Western theory or theorists of Western political society, tending to think about caste as a form of non-political difference, that is, as a manifestation of hierarchy, and something that contrasts with the idea of equality. And I think that divide has tended to really be quite operative. And it takes shape in different forms. Different theorists and academics might think about that division in different ways. But I think the idea of caste really is something attached to societies of the East, if you will, and something that doesn't sit well with the question or the problem of equality, I think is one really big remaining fault line. And a lot of the new conceptual work and a lot of the new academic and intellectual work has really tried to rethink that fundamental divide. The second, I think, is perhaps another fault line or another divide, which operates for scholars of South Asia themselves. And here is where the kind of critique and some of the major critiques of the ignoring of caste, including by critical caste studies, I think comes in, which is that scholars of South Asia, typically those who have tended to think about caste, its social pertinence and its importance, its analytic centrality for understanding Indian society, have also tended by and large to accept that caste is somehow historically distinct, that it is somehow subcontinental, it's a form of subcontinental difference. And so the fault line here, or these two kind of major fault lines, what they do together is, I think, to prevent us from thinking about the politics of caste, the political ethics of caste, if you will, in perhaps a more robust, globally ramified fashion, but also to think about the ways in which caste might itself function as a very important and distinctive form of inequality. And so for those, I think, who analyze caste as it exists, that is, as a system and a structure, you want to think about this analytically, and address how it impacts those perniciously affected by it, that is, the marginalized, the discriminated, the exploited. The challenge really lies in explaining how this complex form of social inequality persists in a post-colonial society. If caste was supposed to become class, well, why does it exist? If we don't, or you've got people who really think about caste as a kind of social embarrassment, not to mention a social evil from the late colonial period onwards. And so there the question is, if caste is simply just going to wither away in liberal democratic societies, why is it that it seems to be transforming, morphing, and changing shape, but perduring in a number of different ways? And, scholars have asked a similar question about race and racism, that we know race because of the ways in which racism manifests, both as a form of, legislated inequality, you might say, but also through new forms and formations of prejudice, exclusion, social forms of exclusion, questions around public access, and so on and so forth. So I think that becomes, in a sense, the puzzle, if you will, for those who are both interested in analyzing caste and in thinking about, if you will, the annihilation of caste, right? How do we engage in that dual project, both of thinking the thing itself and thinking about its disappearance or the ways in which we might work towards its disappearance? especially in a context where anti-colonialism and anti-colonial nationalism has often taken up all the oxygen in the room. And I know many of you might challenge this, but the argument has been that anti-colonial thought, both sociologically, that is in terms of the people on the ground who name themselves as anti-colonial activists and thinkers, but also in the way that anti-colonial thought operates as a challenge to colonial sovereignty, ideas around self-determination and so on, that, that ends up taking up all of the oxygen in the room. And one could even think about the critiques of Gandhi and Gandhianism that have been made by numerous Ambedkarites or Dalit activists, not to mention Ambedkar himself. And Gandhi perhaps would be the sort of both the most radical and the one that really stands at the limits of thinking about the ways in which anti-colonialism begins to approach the question of caste, casteism, and caste exclusion. And so the new conversation, so this is just really a bit of ground clearing to give you a sense of what is at stake, that there's been a lot of conversation, a lot of writing about caste. No one who studies South Asia can ignore the question of caste, as they cannot ignore the question of religion and gender. As I said, these are major cleavages. But to just begin to give you a sense that there is a multidisciplinary conversation around caste, but the conversation really here is about how to understand what it is. How do we give it a kind of social or an analytic rigor, if you will, and not quite interested perhaps in thinking about the question of abolition and annihilation of caste. So these new conversations about caste, which are happening very much as a result of anti-caste political and cultural formations on the ground today, ongoing protest around the invisibilization of issues of access and exclusion within the academy, and the new formations of violence and censorship within and without the academy, must be located within the context of this historical study or the analytical study of caste that I've proposed and put forward to you. And we also have today, of course, the new focus on traveling caste, on caste in the South Asian diaspora, both in the UK and now in the US, where there's an absolutely vibrant and extremely contentious, conflicted conversation going on. And this is the kind of social surround, if you will, that I think has forced a new moment of reckoning. There have been many moments before, but just to think through the present moment. So if we do think about the present, how would we historicize the present? Really now not thinking so much about caste as an analytic, but also bringing caste perhaps into the domain of everyday life and social practice. So where do we find ourselves? So if we think about the present then, we could probably think about the last 30 years, which is, the present for me. So we could start with Mandal and Mandal 2, the ways in which Mandal and Kamandal come together, right? Hindutva 1.0, if I can put it that way, which marks that moment around a kind of, new or a rethinking of caste and the study of caste. Numerous other, what we might call critical events, the World Conference Against Racism in 2001, the rise of the BSP, which I think is absolutely significant because the BSP, unlike other Dalit political formations in other regions, including in Maharashtra, where I work, actually becomes a kind of main player in the political firmament, right? Unlike other Dalit political parties, which remain in some sense, either in a position of creating coalitions or being co-opted and so on. The BSP really takes over a very distinctive political space. So I think that's a critical event, if you will. There's the questions and the many, many, many critiques and conversations around Ambedkar and the textbook controversy. There's Rohit Vemula. There's the changing nature more broadly yet of caste and class relations in this period of neoliberalism, where the state is profoundly transforming the face of the state. We're in a period of jobless growth for the last 2 decades at least, and in the midst of a massive agrarian crisis. So in many ways, all of the kind of fundaments, not just of the late colonial period, which I spoke to you a little bit about, but the moment of constitutionalism and beyond that of Nehruvian development and developmentalism is really fully and firmly over, right? And we need to think about some of the ground conditions of the nature of the state, politics, the economy, and so forth, that are shaping and reshaping the conversations of caste as well. So like earlier moments of crisis, what historians might call a conjuncture, where a number of social forces are in flux and come together also to divert the status quo, we are in one such moment now. And these broader sociopolitical changes are indeed underway, spurred by a change, as I said, in the state form, the privatization of welfarism, jobless growth, the agrarian crisis, the new forms and the emergent forms of precarity, which I think are also transforming the ways in which we think about both caste and class, and these new emergent, what I might just call caste-class formations that we see. But I think the current moment that we find ourselves in, the absolute current moment, is that what we are seeing on the ground is a kind of interesting relationship between two particular minority communities and minority formations, and the ways in which they are aligning or are related to the broader project of Hindu majoritarianism. And I think here what we see is that Muslim communities are increasingly ghettoized, and they're experiencing a near total exclusion from political power. Certainly, if we think about this in terms of the post-colonial moment and constitutionalism. Meanwhile, Dalit communities are vulnerable, excessively visible to the state in contemporary India in a number of ways, from political party formations to caste atrocities, the conversations, the ongoing questions around gender and sexuality, and so on. So insurgent mobilization and persistent demands for affirmative action, reservations notwithstanding, social exclusion and violence are key mechanisms by which Dalits' visibility is manifest and caste privilege is also being reproduced. So in a sense of negative externality, that is the excision from the body politic, defines Muslims' relationship to the Indian state today. Dalits, I want to suggest, are marked by forms of negative sociality, that is practices of prejudice, humiliation, corporal violence that secure the relationship between Dalits and caste Hindus. So in many ways, this is a question of a kind of internal and an external process of minoritization, if I can put it that way. This logic of the ways in which a kind of dominant majority organizes itself around what I would call a kind of situation of competing minoritization, or a very interesting and paradoxical relationship between two very significant minority communities, carries over and is really a hangover. It's an aftermath of colonial politics and the colonial identification of Hindus and Muslims as majority and minority communities, and the very complex and changing status of the scheduled castes, Dalits, in this equation. And I think this continues to structure democratic politics in India today. And it produces a very interesting, from a theoretical perspective, and on the ground, a very difficult set of political predicaments in the ways in which we are to think about what's happening to democratic formations today. So I'm just going to leave that there just to give you a sense of the present in terms of where we are now as a kind of add-on to the analytic study of caste that I put before you. So now I want to move to this question of critical studies and where they stand and what they're doing. So in my own mind, I distinguish, given this kind of a background that I've laid out before you, I distinguish three interrelated spaces, which I don't think can be compared with each other. So I think there is the question of critical caste studies, what is happening to caste today, caste as indeed the interesting jati varna formation that we know, take it either at the textual level of varna or take caste on the ground in terms of jati, regional caste clusters. But I think caste itself and what it is profoundly transforming today. And so critical caste studies, in some sense, is an effort to think and to forefront a kind of project of politicizing the category of caste in this kind of critical manner across the disciplines. So this really has a very long genealogy, and this is what I've tried to suggest, that the study of caste is long. People have tried to understand what caste is. They might not have thought about how to end caste. But I think caste studies kind of stands in that space. And I'm bringing this forward because there have been a lot of conversations and a lot of debate, I think, in the broader public sphere around the new emergent studies of caste and the kind of different studies and different formations that are emerging. The second and quite distinctive formation in the study of caste is Dalit studies. And I think that has a very distinctive project of thinking about the excluded, the stigmatized, the kind of minority form, if you will, what is both inside and outside, apart, as Ambedkar would call it. But Dalit studies is quite distinctive in the ways it thinks about the project, both of identity. I mean, the focus is on Dalits, so we need to know who they are, where they stand, and how they operate in relationship to a broader community of caste. And then a whole distinctive set of conversations about the relationship of Dalit studies to African American political thought, for instance, other forms of solidarity and affinity that Dalit studies might be in conversation with, if you will, but also distinctive cultural and political formations. And I do want to distinguish this from the study of caste, because I think if we think about critical caste studies and what's happening with the broader transformation of caste, we also need to put a lot of pressure on the, let me use this term, this is not the right term, the kind of exceptional status that Dalit studies has created for itself. Because I think there are very new antagonisms that are emerging in the public sphere and in the public political space that we need to think through by putting critical caste studies and Dalit studies in conversation with each other. This really is an effort to think about anti-caste thought as a specific form of thought, which is to say that it carries a systematicity to it. There are governing terms and concepts. For instance, the term Shudra Atishudra for Phule, who tries to imagine a new community of the dispossessed, is itself a technical term for him. It's a political vocabulary that he creates. Ambedkar's own use of the term social democracy is a technical term. And when I say technical, I mean that it is a term of art. He uses it, he reuses it, he experiments with what he means by the term. And so we see a kind of internal, if you will, consistency or a debate in the ways in which anti-caste thought is trying to think about the terms through which it wants to understand society. And this, I think, is absolutely critical because earlier studies, whether it's of working class protests or rebellion, or even the Subaltern Studies Collective, which puts forward a very interesting argument about where and how we should think about political agency. For all of those earlier formations, the focus actually is on action, that people resist, and we know it because they did something. They went out, they protested, something transformed, they rebelled, and so on. But the question of thought itself as such is not prioritized. And I think this is the real focus and the force of anti-caste thought, the effort to think Ambedkar as a thinker, right? And we have any number of studies. I think they're all biographies, and they're not, most of them are not doing the kind of work on anti-caste political philosophy. But I think this turn towards thinking about anti-caste thought as a formation, as an intellectual formation, is extremely important. And what I'm suggesting to you here also is that there are different intellectual stakes, constituencies, and forms of reading or interpretive practices that gather around people who want to think about critical caste studies versus Dalit studies versus, anti-caste thought. They constitute their object and their analysis, their forms of investigation differently. They have intellectual genealogies that I don't think should be collapsed the one into the other. There might be some value to thinking about the difference of these streams of thought, as well as their points of intersection. And the first step in this critique, and I'll just sort of go through this in a sense to think through what's entailed in the kind of pressure that these forms of thought are putting on the work that we do as academics, as pedagogues, as students, and so on. And the first step, of course, has been a kind of claim to place oneself, that one wants to think through the kind of function of where one is placed socially, sociologically. And I think this is a very difficult thing to do. It's quite easy to say, well, this is who I am. I come from a Deshastha Brahmin family. I grew up in Bangalore for the first 10 years of my life. I was introduced to African-American political thought, which formed a very important aspect of the ways in which I began to think about questions of racialization, and that it is through this that one comes to caste. I mean, that kind of intellectual biography is an easy thing to do. But I think the more difficult question to ask is, what really does that kind of social and intellectual formation do? Because identity, of course, is not destiny. And identitarianism can also shut down conversations. I'm saying things that others have said. I don't think there's anything new or distinctive here to what I'm saying. But it does seem to me that there is something very important in asking this question as well. Because when we talk about caste, can there be a more subtle and pernicious divide than caste's fundamental division between thinking and doing? The entire caste order is predicated on the divide between intellectual and manual labor. The political theorist Gopal Guru has described this divide and the ways it continues into the academy as one between, or a divide between, theoretical Brahmins and empirical Shudras. But I like better what my good friend Aniket Zavre called beautifully and quite powerfully as the difference between societies of inheritance, which is caste, versus societies of acquisition, what one comes into, which is, we tend to think of this as class or chosen communities rather than inherited or embodied ones. Gender, too, would be a society, if you will, of inheritance. And so it seems to me that here the question really that's being asked, or the ways in which the new conversations about caste, the pressure that they're putting on thinking about intellectual labor itself, is that they're asking us to work with a model of complicity and responsibility. That this is a model of unlearning, if you will. This is the way I think of it. And it does pose some very important questions. And I think and work as my field site is the classroom. So it does pose a lot of questions about the sociology of the classroom, questions of representation, the conversations around merit, which are pernicious, to put it mildly, and are a kind of red herring in the broader conversation about inherited privilege, challenges to the work of disciplines, disciplinarity, how we do the work we do as academics, embedded inequalities, and the invisibilizing of exclusions and the ways in which we might participate in them. So the Indian context here is quite paradoxical, it seems to me, because the state mandates commitments to social inclusion, which have tended to prioritize caste. Democratization has actually happened through the category of caste. And yet, as we know, in institutional Brahmanism perdures. Caste-oppressed students are stigmatized, they're contrasted with students who enter universities by merit. There's an assumed denial as well of caste in the classroom. And so the question of what we mean by democratic education, both the question of democratic access and inclusion at the point of entry, but more significantly, education as civic formation, that place where one might create or craft something like the constitutional morality that Ambedkar talks about can be modeled, becomes really, difficult and important both. And the reorganization of higher education across the world. I mean, I'm coming from Columbia, where we have had encampments on campus, and there is an ongoing assault on students, on faculty, on academic freedom, and so on. So it seems to me that the reorganization of higher education globally is making these questions very difficult, even as they're becoming absolutely present. And the university and the classroom is, of course, a very significant place because it is a place for random encounter, cross-caste engagement, and so forth that can occur in less constrained or choreographed circumstances. Young people often don't know who they will become. This is the great thing about it, right? And they don't know which class is going to transform them and so on. The American university classroom today has a substantial representation of students from across the South Asian diaspora. This diaspora is complex and encompasses different histories of indenture and working class struggle on the one hand, as well as elite educational achievement and economic success, post-1965 immigration on the other. And contemporary caste has tended to travel along these circuits of professional attainment, with the composition of South Asians in the US skewed to the predominance of privileged castes, with oppressed castes existing as a minority within a minority. So just as legacy admissions at American universities are now seen to qualify merit-based claims, but always in terms of a legacy of privilege, could we consider caste to be a legacy of historical discrimination that also qualifies for merit-based claims in the US context? And this has been a very difficult dance in some sense, largely because of the ways in which the politics of affirmative action works in the United States, the ways in which caste is discussed or evident or not, the ways in which it's invisibilized, and the really quite major distinction between South Asian diasporic students who might think of affinity and solidarity with other Black and Brown communities on the one hand, and South Asians, especially graduate students, who've been part of a kind of South Asian environment here and in the Indian context and then come to the United States. And all of this, I think, is happening, as I've said, as and in the context where the beneficiaries of inherited privilege claim to be its victims. And this is happening across the board, whether it's the assault on affirmative action globally, the EWS, and the ways in which there's been a radical transformation of the logic of reservations in India, whether it be with the Maratha reservations or the EWS, which undoes and inverts the logic of the origins of reservations and the philosophy around it and so on. So this is sort of just the kind of context in which one is operating. And now let me just move to a couple of quick things. And as I said, I will move to Ambedkar, and I'll move to Ambedkar in the classroom at Columbia, because that's really where I wanted to go by opening up the question of caste in the classroom. And I guess two quick things, and I'll try to just very briefly mention them. The conversations in the US, of course, there's been a major conversation about caste in the classroom and caste in the diaspora. The other big conversation has been, and many of you, I think, know this text, but Isabel Wilkerson's text, Caste, Its Origin and Discontents, had an outsized role to play in the conversations about global caste. I think the book is wrong-headed, let me say that. But this is a text that begins by comparing India, the United States, and Nazi Germany as societies of caste. Now, such comparison, the idea of using caste to think about other caste-like formations, including race in the US, was hardly unique. But what Wilkerson did, which I think was very interesting, just because the book is a public book, it's not a work that only 200 other people are going to read. It's not an academic monograph in that way. And what Wilkerson did there that I think was very interesting is that she inverted and deprioritized race as the transhistorical signifier in favor of caste's more capacious itineraries. And this, I think, was really significant. Now, the reason she did this was to say race in America is American caste. And so the uses to which she put her own argument, I think, are faulty, to put it mildly. But the idea that Wilkerson tries to think about caste as anterior and structuring is interesting. And it renewed interest in questions around historical comparison, including about the caste-race comparison. And we could, of course, ask whether the idea of politicizing race might essentialize caste or vice versa. Could we ignore the fact that one system predated the formation of states, while the other was imposed by state power, race, or that one predated capitalism and the other emerged during its peak, slavery and capitalism? So all of these questions remain. There's much to be critical of with this text. But I think what Wilkerson did was to play a very big role in the return or a renewed interest in a very long history of race-caste comparison. And maybe comparison is a wrong term to use. They are translations or analogies, very often using caste to think about race as a status hierarchy, to think about race as not being merely economic and so on. And I'd also say that, a large part of the comparison of race and caste is predicated on a kind of conceptual misfire rather than an effort to really create any complementarity between them. But be that as it may, I think it opened up the question of the status of caste as a kind of provincial category, right? So efforts to deprovincialize caste. There's a renewed interest in a long history of political solidarity and allyship that has animated internationalism of varying stripes, and the ways in which modern democracies might all be seeking to think about how to redress civic disability and historical discrimination through innovative legal and policy means. So what I want to now do is to move to Ambedkar, because Ambedkar has a rather contradictory set of views on the race-caste comparison. And I just briefly wanted to go over that, and I wanted to remind you of what I said, that he is somebody who from the very start thinks about the asocial sociability of caste. I mean, Ambedkar is always innovating, but he's also a person of his time, and he doesn't, none of these ideas come to him de novo. I just want to remind you of the organizing philosophy of the body that caste hews to. So we might recall that the origin of caste is a story of dismemberment of a complex whole that we might call society. Here, the metaphorical social whole is imagined as already separated and divided. It's given a form through the parceling of body parts associated with social function. Speech with the Brahmin, the arms with the Kshatriya, and so on, right? So there is really a kind of logic of linking, right, social form or social function with body parts. And when I say this is a logic of dismemberment, we could think about logics of aggregation. I guess the one that comes to mind is Hobbes's Leviathan, where Leviathan is pictured as if you've seen the very important photo, I think from the etching from 1658 of Leviathan, this is of a large man who contains multitudes within himself. Instead, here we have a logic of dismemberment. And so what we see here is a homology or a kind of, a homology and isomorphism between the social function and body part, which is actually predicated on the mutilation of the body. The body politic is torn asunder. It's divided at its very origin. And I think this is extremely important because Ambedkar too argued that the social whole, and I'm thinking about that first text, Castes in India, the one that he writes when he is a student sitting in the classroom, being exposed to a number of sociological theories. It's a very eclectic, kind of a crazy text, actually, 15 pages, a very difficult text, I think, to read, and people have tended to read it somewhat easily. But in any case, in that text, that very early text, Ambedkar too will begin to argue that the social whole is internally divided in the society of caste. This is something that he keeps coming back to. He does this with greater force in The Annihilation of Caste, of course. In fact, he will argue that the whole is so internally divided that it is neither the sum of its parts, nor can it represent them. So castes, he will argue, are agonistically related to each other through a violent separation. And they are pulled together by the forces of imitation in that early text, imitation of the Brahmin caste. Caste, there he will argue, is both a living relic, an archaic remnant that has persisted through the perpetuation of Brahmanism as a social power. But caste is also something, it's a social power that is feared, resented, but most of all imitated. And here he draws on a set of theories around imitation, social habit, and so on, drawing on Gabriel Tard, who was locked in a lifelong battle with Durkheim and lost that battle. But in any case, he draws on Tard to think about this logic of imitation. And he talks here, and he does something quite interesting here, which he doesn't really quite return to again, which is that he focuses on imitation and the logic of caste as being psychosocial. And he talks about imitation as a psychological act, something between instinct and conscious action, and something that is located, this logic of imitation, he says, is located in very obscure parts of the mind, quote unquote. It's not conscious or accessible to reason. But because imitation is prevalent across society, no one can ignore the infection of imitation. So social mimesis, he will argue, is an element of a kind of social psychology. And this, Ambedkar wants to argue, is absolutely crucial in thinking about the logic of caste. So Brahmanism mimetically reproduced, down the graded hierarchy, that caste is a graded inequality. This is one important argument that he makes. And the second important argument that he makes, of course, and you know this well too, is the argument about caste and Brahmanism itself as being predicated, as being dependent on repetitive sexual violation and violence. So the logic of the surplus woman, so the ideas that attach especially to upper caste women around sati, widow remarriage, child marriage, and so forth, that all of these, he argues, are ways in which we can think through the social order of caste as being fundamentally dependent on a sexual ordering, as well as this logic of annihilation, the disposability of the surplus woman, as Ambedkar will argue. So these two logics, one sexual-social, or socio-sexual on the one hand, and the other psychosocial, are both put forward in this early text in order to explain the ways in which caste originates, perdures, and reproduces itself, a fundamental sociological question of what kind of a group does caste form. And in response to his own question, what is the class that raised an enclosure around itself in order to become a caste? Ambedkar will go into the logic of the exclusivity of the Brahmin and argue right from the get-go that this is a political and rather than a natural ordering of the social. 20 years later, in The Annihilation of Caste, Ambedkar prioritizes the relationship between untouchability and Hindu religion as the point of contradiction that brings caste itself, the idea, the system, to crisis. He will note that Hindu society as such does not exist. It is only a collection of castes. But in this early text, because I think this is an extremely sophisticated analysis of caste as a political philosophy, what Ambedkar alerts us to is the fundamental asociality of caste. So in a sense, Ambedkar uses all of the tools of the sociologist who wants to understand how groups are formed in order to tell us that fundamentally caste is this exceptional, crazy, schizophrenic social structure, which is actually predicated on the fact that society cannot cohere, that a caste society is actually an impossibility, that society actually can't exist, and that what we have is a set of fractions, I suppose. I think this is a very, very profound early rendering and rethinking of the order of caste as being predicated not just on violence, but on its asociality, that castes actually don't interact, they don't have intercourse with each other. And it puts forward a kind of radical challenge to the entire history of the analysis or the scholarship of caste that I began by talking to you about. And so in the end is the beginning and the beginning is the end. But let me end with that.